A fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one important thing. It's one important thing. It's one important thing.
Welcome to the Spiritual Hedgehog podcast, where we explore the role philosophy and faith play in your daily life. Here are your hosts, Ira Gardner and Pastor Eric Dahl.
So, I thought one of the things that we'd have to face about with, as you and I talked, and it was a couple things running through my head, is how do we deal with things in culture when it just doesn't, take the good things and leave the stuff behind without throwing everything out, as the old saying, throwing out the baby at the bathwater. So growing up in St. Louis Park, I think I've said this to you before, I grew up with, we'd have a Jewish holiday and we'd know it. 30% of the church or the school would be emptied on major Jewish holidays. And some of that, and we had Holocaust education in our classrooms. It was a big part of my middle school experience that really opened my ears up to kind of the anti-Semitism. And then even playing soccer, I remember I was called a kike more than once on the soccer field. One time, I remember playing Minnetonka, and I'd taken I slid tackled the guy, and he went down, and God, get off of me, you kike. And it was just this sort of startling, not Jewish, but I grew up in St. Louis Park. The other aspect, so I learned a lot about anti-Semitism, but ironically did not know that Luther had this really dark, until I hit seminary, this dark side about anti-Semitism. So I think thinking about that experience growing up in St. Louis Park, reading and kind of knowing where, the Holocaust sort of developed then, and some of Martin Luther's, some of it stemmed from his very teachings, or at least they co-opted some of those things. And then everything to thinking about, as today, I think the last thing I sent you was, we can think about that in Islam, we can think about it in all the different world faiths, but also just in culture, how do you not just throw everything out? Like, I used to love Bill Cosby's comedy, and now, is it wrong to listen to it now? Is it wrong to listen to, and to laugh at it, knowing what we know about his personal life?
The same is being said about great artists, because do you throw out the art with the artist because of some improprieties on the artist maybe not being such a upstanding human being, and yet they've created this incredible art? So I think that was kind of this overarching idea of wondering, how do you accept the good without somehow being stained by the negative, or as I put it in my email to you, how do we draw out the wisdom without drawing out the poison?
Right.
And
that's a nice way to say it.
And it's interesting to hear your experience about anti-Semitism, because I grew up with the name Ira, which outside of New York City, you don't hear, or Israel, you don't hear the name Ira very often. And yet I was a fifth generation Ira in my family. And there was always this assumption growing up that I was Jewish, even though there was no history of it in our, at least known talk about history of it. And in fact, my father was rather disappointed when he got the DNA test results back that said, sorry, you're not Jewish. Which, that's a whole nother side conversation about cultural identity versus genetic identity. But anyway, I grew up with this kind of strange relationship between always being treated as if I was Jewish, and yet my mother had been Catholic. And I remember the first time I went to a Saturday evening service at St. Mark's Lutheran Church, and it was near Christmas time, and all these wonderful people were wearing their Norwegian and Swedish sweaters with reindeers and snowflakes and all this. And I remember introducing myself the very first night there. And I said, hi, my name's Ira. And this person just kind of stepped back and said, wow, what are you doing here? I would expect you to be more at a synagogue. And I'm like, Really? In
Yeah,
this day
yeah,
and age, I didn't know that was, it's still top of mind, and you see it in our country right now with the increased nationalism, that it makes me a little concerned about this. And whether I'm Jewish or not Jewish doesn't really matter to me. It's more
hmm
about how do we grow our acceptance and our love for all faiths and all cultures,
yeah.
and in particular, how do we deal with Luther and the teachings of Lutheranism, which have this wonderful quality about appealing directly to God without an intermediary,
hmm
and a lot of great things, and yet we also have this dark side.
Well, it's a couple, just as we're talking, a couple things that kind of occurred to me is I remember my first experience really of going, oh, this is what anti-Semitism's about. Is I went over to my best friend that lived across the street from me. He was going to be, moving to Edina. In Edina in Minnesota was known, that's the cake eaters, right? And so I was teasing them about moving over, which is also wrong to do, right? You have the stereotypical that you do that way. And he goes, yeah, but my mom said, at least I'll be with a bunch of rich Christians instead of a bunch of rich Jews. And I went, Steve, you would have never said that before. Where is this coming from? And there's this deep seated stuff, this distrust that you just kind of wonder where it comes from. And so I had to do even, and people don't always start that way. Even Luther didn't start that way. It's so he had this huge. He thought the reason the Jews were getting such a hard time in Germany and in the Roman Empire was because they had been treated so badly by the Roman Catholic Church at first. And so back in I think it was 1523, he wrote an essay entitled I think it's called That Jesus Was Born a Jew, and really saying, hey, they are really our people, the same, but it all said kind of, I think his whole thinking was around this idea. And if they only knew the gracious God that we see in Romans and that we see in Ephesians, then they would come to Christ and they would be Christians as well. Well, literally 20 years later, he wrote The Jews and Their Lies. And this is shocking, and it's just this venomous article that he shows cruelty and intolerance and thinking that they have no part in German society or Roman, or society, even in the neighboring communities. He was active in trying to get them out of some of the German territories that he was involved with. And you wonder what happens, what turns, us to start just focusing one direction. And often I think it's one or two people that we can, say they're different than us. And then since they're different than us, I'm going to find the negative, and then which we can all do no matter who we're looking at, we can find the negative. And so we see that now in Islam, just this huge, when you talk about nationalism, this huge fear and all these things, that Islam is not a peaceful religion. Definitely there are places where it's not, but then we stereotype it to the whole.
Well, look at Sufism and how peaceful and loving that tradition of Islam is. But I want to go back to something, because I will tell you that my experience of going into church, there's always different seasons and there's different themes, and right after Christmas we get into Lent, and we get into kind of this whole preparation for the crucifixion of Christ. And I always remember that there's a couple of sermons that generally come out that every year make me a little uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
One of which is when Jesus goes into the temple and gets angry at the money changers happening outside the temple, and this idea of the corruption of these oh, forgive me, the Jewish leaders, the clergy, so to speak.
Yeah, the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Yeah,
Yep, yep.
and what I find myself wondering is if that becomes the justification, the righteous indignation that labels the whole religion based upon that one story as being corrupt. And then you go on to the story of, the crucifixion and Pontius Pilate asking, do you want him crucified? And the chorus of Jews saying, crucify him. And I think those two sermons always make me cringe a little, because those stories, I think, get extrapolated and painted with a broad brush as a justification, so to speak, of the superiority of Christianity over the Jewish faith.
Right.
And what are your thoughts about that? Because I just find myself thinking that every year we revisit these.
It's interesting. Yeah, no, it's true, and it's especially true in John's gospel. John's gospel really, there's such a tension that comes out in the language, and it's often how things are translated. So Ira, that we had our local rabbi, and forgive me if I'm forgetting our dear rabbi's name in town here, came and was our preacher on Fat Tuesday this. But knowing French stuff, I know sometimes you'll be in conversation and people will find out you're Lutheran. If you're talking to rabbis and things, they always will start that says they're a little startled and thinking, well, what does that Lutheran? Just like, what does it mean that you're Jewish? Where does that take you? But it's a much more cautious, because of our very poor history, at least in Lutheran Church. So I've been doing some research on this subject. Actually, just last time I went to a conference on the Gospel of John. Caroline Lewis, my professor for that conference, who teaches at Luther Seminary, said, she really thinks we need to change the language on how we refer to this stuff, and said, instead of wherever it says the Jews, not just talking about the Jews, it is talking about the Jewish leaders and it's really this tension of what's happening of God and so much the faith-based, just like I'll go through these and flows. And she said, should not just Jews. In fact, think about how we read that. The Jewish leaders were discussing instead of the Jews, where it's grouped into this big, massive, thought. And the other thing that's happened is all religions, I think there's a fear that somehow I'm going to be proven wrong. Instead of, what do I have to offer into this conversation? Where if being right and wrong in marriage, if it's all about who is right and who is wrong, it's true in faith practices. It's all about who is right and who is wrong. It's going to be a non-starter. We're not going to have civil conversation. We're not going to learn from one another. We're not going to see that God is much bigger than the tribes that we. So much of religion is, I think, gets turned into tribalism, where, as we were talking about nationalism earlier, it gets hooked into this nationalism of we have to be the biggest, the most powerful, and the right ones. And that means if I'm right, somebody else has to be wrong. And so, like I was saying, one of the things I will do when I do pre-marriage counseling is I will talk with the couple about, you need to give up the idea that somebody has to be right and somebody has to be wrong. And the more you can do that, the more peace you're going to have in your relationship. If you realize that the arguments you're getting in, yes, there's passion behind that, but the thing that chips it into a danger zone is when you have to try to prove the other person wrong. I think the same thing happens in faith life. I think so often, you grow up and it's part of your identity of who you are. And then as you're exposed to new things, there's that fear factor that enters in, that says, what if I've been wrong my whole life on all of this? Instead of saying, entering in with that sense of curiosity that says, God has spoken to me through what I know, and yet God is speaking through other people. I hope God's not nearly as judgmental as I can tend to be. And so what can I learn? How can I grow and take those things from Buddhism, from Sufism, from the different branches of Islam, from my Jewish brothers and sisters, and saying there's a depth of knowledge in all these great world religions, all these great faiths that can speak truth to me, and I don't have to enter in some sort of fear. And the more I can not worry about having to be right and having to defend myself and just really share where I am in my journey, the better I think my sense of how God is calling me kind of comes out, and how I grow with God expands.
Well, what's interesting is so much about wisdom, and we started this kind of with the premise of how do you draw out the wisdom without drawing out the poison. So the primary argument, I think, in all wisdom practices is a move towards what's known as non-duality or non-dualism.
Yeah.
And dualism is when you have this conflict of right or wrong, this or that, and non-dualism says yes,
Mm-hmm.
in a big capital Y. And I think about, for example, one of my favorite quotes from the Bible is basically, and I'm paraphrasing, Paul saying that what might be a sin for me might not be for you. What might be a sin for you might not be for me. And, my own experience, for example, I've studied Taoism, and I got to tell you, this idea of this universal force that we're all connected to. Last summer, and throughout, I had a sabbatical last fall. I had a walking meditation practice where every day I would go for a walk. There's this beautiful trail right behind our house, and it's about a 3-mile round trip. And every day I notice the subtle nuances of change in nature and the trees and the birds. And in fact, my wife and I, we love the birds in our yard. We watch birds. And I felt so alive and so connected. I'm like, well, no, yeah, it makes complete sense that Taoism would evolve this thought process because I'm having this experience. And I tend to look at it as, is it the longitude and latitude on the globe that all lead to the same North Pole or the same South Pole? That there's just these different world views that get us there, so to speak. And it's not one or the other. It's just, I really appreciate, for example, in my grandmother, when she was 85, gave me a copy of the Dalai Lama book, The Four Noble Truths. Now, my grandmother, she listened to Mahalia Jackson. She singing gospel. She went to church every Sunday, but she also read the Dalai Lama book and passed it on to me and said, "This is some really good things that you need in your life." And in the first chapter, he says, the West thinks they need to adopt the East, but they actually have Jesus. They already have a Buddha in their cultural tradition. You don't have to abandon one for the other. And I think of the artist Vic Muniz, who's from Brazil, and he talks about every indigenous culture that gets dominated and converted to some new belief system. They don't abandon their existing system. You don't have to choose one or the other. You can embrace new wisdom, new knowledge, new love, layers of love, so to speak. And I also think of a dear friend of mine who is homosexual, who says, and he's a practicing Roman Catholic. and Roman Catholic Church has not exactly come out and said, oh, that's welcome here, but he has made peace with it, saying, you know what, if we're all looking up to God, we don't have time to be looking at each other with judgment. And I kind of agree with that.
Yeah. No, that's nice. And I think I'm always amazed when people can do that. Somehow they'll model what their spiritual teacher has said, even in the midst when judgment is being turned against them. So I think about that often. There's a reason, that the GLBTQ and on community has struggled with finding that place of acceptance. So back to our question of then how do we share? I think we always, what I always think about is, how do I share the best of what Jesus has to offer? And to me, the best of what Jesus has to offer is love. And so thinking, if that is true, if trying to love better is our, in a sense, my pursuit, my personal pursuit is, how do I love my wife better each day? Obviously, some days I do that well, some days I don't, but I keep trying in some senses, because Jesus said, the greatest command, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, love your neighbor as yourself. So obviously there's something to that. If all of the commandments can be put into those two things, which I think they can, and I think in some ways all spiritual teachings, great spiritual teachings, kind of end up flowing back into that sense of how do we love one another? How do we, and how do we love God? And how do we love ourselves then in the midst of that it's the journey that we take. And I think so gleaning some of that stuff out to always say, what is it that we always hear, Ira, of why, people have left the faith? Well, I read the Old Testament and saw the violence and war in there, and religion is the cause of all wars. And I always want to say, no, religion's always been in the place where those wars have been happening. And they tend to happen when people switch their allegiance away from God and toward nation or toward power or toward one of these other avenues that they think is going to help them be on top. So it's curious to me. And, so I don't know, how do we answer that question, like to kind of return to Luther, who on the one hand had these awful things to say, and really the Hitler Party and the German church that developed out of the Hitler Party quoted Luther and gleaned some of this stuff. And yet Luther is also the one that said, we are justified by grace through faith, not by what we do, but what God has done. And because of that, we do not have to earn our right into heaven, that we are already made children of God. Well, what a beautiful thing to say, juxtaposed to this awful stuff where he could be, a real ass. Luther was known not to mince words and to really have this edge to him, and he had foul, he had foul language that, so it's a struggle. And yet I think if we look at ourselves, look at our own stories, and if people would dismiss us by the mistakes that we did at a certain age, or the mistakes that we made in certain relationships when, sometimes we even thought we were going in the right direction. You look back and you go, yeah, I really screwed that up. And yet hopefully people can also look at me and say, there's some very loving things about him. There's some, through the saint, to use another Luther phrase, simul justus et peccator, we are simultaneously saint and sinner. The more we can acknowledge and still be able to name that sinner part, the struggle I have. I mean, if I'm just being honest about it. So like, I look at somebody like Bill Cosby, who somehow just doesn't seem to be able to see what he did to women as wrong, or, that was all consensual, or just isn't able to admit to himself. And yet some of his humor and some of the things he has done have really brought joy to so many people in the past. How do we look at that? How do we name it for what it is?
Well, yeah, and how do you not paint with too broad a brushstroke to all the
Right.
actors and actresses and well, just use actor as the generic term, right? And all the production crew, the directors, the writers, et cetera, that put their heart and soul into that production. But on the other hand, I find myself going, but there's so much more content out there to embrace that I don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about that I don't have that going away, or better yet, that triggering an ongoing conversation is probably the best outcome you can hope for. I mean, to me, just the ability to have the conversation. The Me Too movement was very, very upsetting for me. In fact, I ended up creating a whole body of work that was in response to it of what would equality look like between men and women, that I had that gallery exhibit about. Because, frankly, my friend, you and I are Gen Xers that grew up in that pivotal generation of changing gender roles, and us having to figure out masculine, feminine, and consent in a world where you and I were raised essentially via TV and John Wayne movies and this whole different sort of cultural language, much the way the Deep South may still be struggling with, how do you take the good and the bad and separate it out? And it's probably more like I don't know. It's a difficult question. And I think the only way we can get through it is by adopting a personal philosophical and spiritual lens that is grounded in love, love and acceptance, and gratitude for the lessons learned, even the painful ones.
Very nice and very well said. I think about so often, you brought up earlier this idea of this dualism that we try to set this world up, is we want to say that's right, that's wrong, and there's nothing in between. And we want to do that then with people too, right? That's right.
We do it with politics.
And we do it with politics. That's right, that's wrong, and there's nothing in between. When we know things are much, much, much more complicated than that. The tension, one of the things in my faith tradition that, and yours too, is that idea of saying we need to allow things to be in tension. I mean, I think when you think about tension in the art world, there's some stuff you could say about that too. But between light and darkness, and how do you? It's not just light, it's not just dark. There's a tension there as well.
We have a term for it. It's called juxtaposition. And in fact, going back to Aristotle, wrote that basically a homogeneous environment is not a thought-provoking one, that it's only the heterogeneous environment of great contrast that provokes great thinking and great wisdom. And so we need difference, we need diversity in order to experience significant meaning in life. We don't know joy without some sorrow. We don't appreciate what we have until we've experienced pain. There's great power in juxtaposition in both our symbolic inner lives as well as in our cultural expressions of it. And so, in my studies of culture and communication and linguistics, we all operate within multiple subcultures all the time. We jump around, and we're able to create our identities and form our tribes. But those formation of tribes should be based on a positive characteristics, not on a differentiation on a negative characteristics. And I'll just give you a really funny, not funny as funny haha, but just as an interesting experience. When I started riding motorcycles, all of a sudden, when I'm riding, all of a sudden I notice that every other motorcyclist out there, they're quick to put out the two fingers of keep your rubber on the road. And there's this camaraderie that exists that I've not experienced in a lot of places outside of team athletics, where you just know that, oh, I have something in common about adventure experiences related to motorcycle, and I found my tribe. And I'm like, yes, this feels really good. But I don't have this sort of, well, I've got to ride a Harley, or I need to ride an adventure sport, or I need to ride a scrambler. It's like, no, we're all riders. It's like what bike you choose and how you go about it, that's your business. But having that experience of feeling like you belong to a tribe is a very positive thing. We all have a strong need to belong. And I think that's why we have so many diverse faith communities as well. Mm-hmm. Where I think it becomes problematic is what feels right for me if I think that that's the only way that it should be for everybody. And I like to challenge people to think about it in their daily life. Are there people in their lives that try to regulate that there's only one way to do it? And can you imagine what that's like if you escalate that to the really important, deep things such as a faith practice, and how problematic that becomes?
Right. No, and we do that. We do that. Sometimes it happens in seasons of our life or in development. I mean, there's a time when we have to be more concrete, sequential, and some of us never, grow out of that. And so the question is when we are faced with folks that aren't going to be self-reflective, how do we continue to have conversation, to nudge and to move without being judgmental from our standpoint in those cases? So, earlier you were talking, the Me Too movement. Have you had the experience, Ira, have you taken like one of those movies, like let's say 16 Candles that we would have watched, and you go, oh, I've got to show my kid, this was one of the greatest movies, and you plop the thing in and you look at it and you go, that is awful. Or your kids will kind of look at you and go, I can't believe you see this as acceptable. The exploitation of women that happen in some of those things. So even as time and oh, you're being too sensitive, you're being, all those things. No, I think it's good for us to have what was funny for us at the time. Well, this is the culture we grew up in. As you were saying, we grew up, with some of those John Wayne songs and, all of those things. Well, to return.
I mean, I go through the list, though. I mean, we saw our world change on TV too, because you saw shows like Mary Tyler Moore. Yep. You saw The Jeffersons. You saw what's the one with Archie Bunker?
All in the Family. Yeah.
All in the Family, and you can see the direct connection to contemporary shows like Colbert that are just using humor to poke at these cultural issues to reveal the duality of it, and how really it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah. Well, thinking about these faith journeys, and it's actually kind of right in the question that we're talking about. I do have a book recommendation, just if you're curious.
I am.
And maybe you've read it already. Timothy Egan's A Pilgrimage to Eternity. We have a number of people that I've been hearing reading this, but it's From Canterbury to Rome in Search of Faith. And he really deconstructs kind of here's supposed to be the saint of, this, and here's where I've struggled with the Catholic faith, and some of the issues that have come up there. And he just goes to this journey, and it's actually a conversation with a Lutheran pastor that helps him come back to think about his faith in a little bit of a different way. but I recommend the book. I'm about halfway through it. I'll let you know what I think about it when I'm totally done now. But
Nice, nice. I'll post a couple of books in our show notes too, because I'm a Thomas Merton fan.
yeah,
Because I really appreciate the fact that here's a Catholic monk that's been granted and encouraged to go out and explore Zen Buddhism. I'm also fascinated with some of the books of Deepak Chopra. He wrote one about considering if Jesus was a Buddha, that is incredibly thoroughly researched. Like, he's got a staff of researchers. And then I'm also fascinated with how I start thinking about the parts of the Bible that got omitted. What's the texts that are a little more mystical.
yeah.
What do they call those? The Gnostic Gospels. And thinking about the fact that there are the equivalent of Gnostic Gospels in just about every faith, and I think about the wisdom and the poetry of Rumi and Khalil Gibran, for example, and how many Christian weddings have quotes from those poets as part of their ceremony. And so, like, there's just this wonderful mix of rituals and traditions and wisdom that come from all these different places, that we only get into trouble if we think in this duality of right or wrong, and what's right for me is law for you.
Right. Yeah.
Which is really, what being a child in a household where, your parents are telling you what to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we have to, there's that point, right? Well, somebody's got to lay down the law, and until you realize there's a point where, for keeping safety and things, that you want to do that, but most of the time we can play. Most of the time we can play with one another to say, what does this speak? We'll have to do a podcast sometime on just thinking about myth and the truth that is in myth, and the truth that happens. But when I want to declare something as truth, as once and for all, I've got to be careful. I've got to be careful what I mean by that, because what I mean by that might be something very different than you mean by that.
Well, that reminds me of Aristotle and his Poetics, writing about metaphor, and that the first term is to the second, as the second is to the third, as the third is to four. And I'm butchering because it gets into some Greek metaphors that wouldn't make sense today. But basically the idea is that, well, okay, then the first is to the fourth term, and you see this gap, this increased gap. And I think a lot of our interpretation of Bible stories is failing to see the metaphor that is teaching a greater truth. And we talk about the challenge in art is that, for example, photography was seen as this purely objective medium, and therefore it couldn't tell any great truth because it couldn't tell a lie. And the idea that the metaphors that are presented through fables and mythology and Bible stories are designed to tell a deeper truth than what being limited to the facts would allow for.
Right. Well, it's right. And the way I would talk about that, you look at the Genesis stories, and I always there's two creation stories. Well, I get pushback from some of our Christian brothers and sisters. No, there can't be two creation stories in there. No, there's two creation stories that come from two different traditions. It's pretty clear as you kind of read the Hebrew and look at those things. And I had a Hebrew teacher that said, we've got to be careful what questions we think our holy words are trying to answer. It's very important to figure out what the question they are trying to answer is when you are reading scripture, because the Bible, for instance, answers many questions, but it doesn't answer every question we bring to it in every passage that we're bringing before us. So, for instance, in those two creation stories in Genesis, one of them wants to show God really down and earthy and forming and molding, and the other one, God speaks and it happens. So the fun part to me then in that is, what are these different traditions trying to answer about God, the God that they're trying to see and understand and move, and so even the different namings of God and all of those things, that they exist in my very faith background. So
Yeah, isn't it like 10 different names for
oh,
God?
easily. Yeah, easily. Yeah. Yeah. So, well, there's, some of the basics there's Elohim, there's Yahweh.
Yahweh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's, well, that just left me again, but Jehovah, there's,
Yeah.
they're all over the place. And, and then to understand why maybe the Jewish faith would never write the name of God down, because since they don't want to limit God to that.
Allah.
Yeah. Yeah. Comes. Yeah. And even to understand that our very faith shares with Islam the fact that God promised Ishmael also to make a great nation, not just out of Abraham, but out of Ishmael as well. Well, that's where they take their root. So fun.
So you reminded me of something just a moment ago that I always tell my students in my classes, is that I'm not here to tell them the answers. I'm here to tell them the questions that they need to discover their own answers to. And I think that so often, if we tell people our answers and expect them to just accept them, that we're shortchanging people tremendously, because it denies the fact that we're all individuals. And I think one of the interesting things about mythology you brought up a moment ago, and I look at the work of Carl Jung on archetypes and the collective unconscious, and this idea that there's more than 12, but there are 12 basic archetypes that every human being goes through. And there's two ideas about this. One is that we go through stages going from innocent to wise. And the other is that we have all 12 in them, and it's situational. And thinking about the fact that, hey, if I'm in a state of emergency, I need to be able to act without a whole lot of thinking. I can't spend time pontificating and trying to be a sage wisdom. I need to respond. And so this idea that we have all these different facets to our personality that we need in all these different situations, even thinking about, I'll throw a little pop culture at you. I have a piano behind me. It's got 88 keys on it. And there's this movie called The Legend of 1900. Have you seen it?
I haven't.
So it's an allegory, if you will, or it's just a myth of this character that was a baby that was abandoned on a cruise ship, that was raised on the cruise ship, never stepped foot off of the cruise ship. And it went back and forth, Europe to New York, Europe to New York, and he just wouldn't leave the ship. And they were going to destroy the ship. And that's the conflict point of, can you get this guy off the ship? And he says, I know the length of the ship, and I know that a piano has 88 keys. And with those 88 keys, I can make infinite music, but I can't deal with the chaos and randomness of what's beyond that ship. But just this idea that even if we only had 12 characteristics, it would create an infinite variety of situations and emotional states of what it means to be a human being, that would make it impossible for there to be one right answer for everybody.
Nicely said. Yeah, what's that movie called again? I need to.
The Legend of 1900. It's
Okay.
just it's a very sweet mythological type of story that really resonated with me, because I think about even with photography and teaching photography, there's infinite number of tones in an image, but really we have to simplify it to about 11 exposure stops of possible exposure range. And then we let everything in between be the gradation. Mm-hmm. And I think, when we talk about non-duality, we have these détentes, if you will, of different beliefs and different viewpoints, but there's unlimited shades of gray in between each one of them.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And see, this conversation could go on and on. I was just thinking about a movie I just watched, but I'll save that for another time. So
That's all right. You brought up 16 Candles. And
yeah.
I will say that I am looking forward to eventually seeing the remake of Top Gun.
I know. Me too. Who knows when that will end up coming out? But I know
That's a guilty pleasure.
Yeah, they are. We have to have some of those for sure. So
Yeah.
well, good.
It's
I
been
hope.
fun.
Yeah, and I hope, as you always say, that people will send their comments in. And there's obviously, this is a rich thing and a rich conversation that needs to continue and will continue. And so we do ask that you leave your comments for us, and someday we'll maybe even respond to them. But we'll see where that goes.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to catching you next time on The Spiritual Hedgehog.
Thank you for joining us today on The Spiritual Hedgehog. For show notes and more information, go to www.thespiritualhedgehog.com.